Deputy Prime Minister Tariq Aziz. He says that Iraq has been trying to turn Yasin over to the United States. But he claims the government in Washington doesn't want the $25 million fugitive.
Twice we asked them to come and take him. They refused, which means that they are not sincere in what they are saying. They are not honest in what they are saying, you see.
The initial offer to turn Yasin over, he says, occurred during the Clinton administration in 1994, a year after that first attack on the World Trade Center.
We informed the American government that we have important information about that event. If you are interested, send a team to Baghdad to get that information.
They actually sent an emissary to the State Department to make the offer.
They did not reply. They did not reply at all, and they did not...
But your information was very vague, wasn't it?
Yeah, but we showed our goodwill.
But would you really expect them to respond to that?
Well, first of all, I have to tell you that we feared that sending Yasin back to Iraq after arresting him and interrogating him was a sting operation.
You thought that the Americans were trying to sting you by sending him back?
Yes.
But for what purpose?
To tell people later on that, look, this man who participated in that event now is in Iraq, etc., and use it, as they are doing now, using many false pretexts, you see, to hurt Iraq in their own way.
To suggest that Iraq was involved in the bombing?
Yes, yes.
So you were very suspicious that he was some kind of plant or...
We have the right to be suspicious of the American intentions.
He says their suspicions were borne out after September 11th, when Yasin was put on the most wanted list. That, he said, led to another, more specific offer.
Dubbed Middle East analyst from D.C.-based Foreign Policy Institute and writer for the National Review, Lori Milroy, who authored the 2000 book, Study of Revenge, Saddam Hussein's Unfinished War Against America, in that there was an Iraqi Saddam connection to the Trade Center bombing, attempted to make a case that Yasin's brother Musab was behind it. Due to his vehicle registration exchange with Yousef and Salameh, Milroy mentions in her notes section towards the end of her book on page 293 in references, it says, Musab Yasin, I was exposed to American pressure to involve Iraq in the Trade Center bombing. Al-Hayat, January 25, 1994. Yasin told Al-Hayat that he was a Muslim fundamentalist but stayed away from its more extreme manifestations. But as Al-Hayat noted, this does not really explain his good relation with Ramzi Yousef. Of course, if we fast forward, this does not pan out too well since Saddam was a socialist Ba'athist who hated Islamic extremists. And from what we can tell, Yousef is no Muslim fundamentalist either. It's very possible that Musab and Abdul Yasin were willfully or indirectly participating in a terrorist action, knowing that U.S. retaliation would follow towards striking Iraq, in their belief not necessarily in spite of being Muslims, but of liberating their home country from Saddam and his regime, which could also be one of the reasons why Abdul is incarcerated in Iraq. Musab's whereabouts are also unknown. But none of these inconsistencies prevented Milroy in trying to make a case to implicate Saddam and the Iraqi regime being behind the Trade Center bombing and future terrorist attacks to come on the U.S., or even boldly stating that Saddam was in cahoots with Osama bin Laden. Aside from marginalizing or overlooking Musab's usage of the Yousef-Ajaj name, as a typical neocon propagandist would do, the main contention with her book is stating that Ramzi's real name is Yousef, and that he's ultimately an Iraqi, based on allegedly falsified and doctored passports and birth certificates from Kuwait. But continuing a bit more with 60 Minutes.
Aziz says Iraq made the offer as a way of proving that it wasn't involved in the '93 bombing and, by extension, 9/11. They're trying to prevent a U.S. attack and preserve the gains the country has made over the last 5 years. All the while in Washington, the debate over getting rid of Saddam Hussein is heating up. We asked the Bush administration to comment on the Iraqi offer to turn Yasin over. The White House told us to call the State Department, which told us to call the White House. Neither building would comment. So we turned to Kenneth Pollack, who handled Iraq issues at both the CIA and the National Security Council during the Clinton administration. He's now with the Council on Foreign Relations. Do you think that Iraq was involved in the '93 bombing?
I've seen the CIA and FBI reports, and there is nothing in them to suggest that the Iraqis were themselves involved in the '93 World Trade Center attack.
One of the things that the Saddam Hussein government has been trying to do for a long time is open a back channel to the United States, to open some kind of a dialogue. Would there be anything wrong with doing that if it started over Yasin?
I think that opening any kind of a secret back channel with the Iraqi government would be a terrible mistake. They would let the whole world know that the United States had been meeting with the Iraqis in secret, and that would feed all of these fears throughout the Middle East that the United States was always looking to cut a deal with Saddam Hussein, that we really wanted to leave him in power and wanted to get out of the Gulf, and that would leave all of our allies in the region high and dry.
Yasin's ethnicity, being of Iraqi descent, was instantaneously exploited by the neocons soon after September 11th with revamping the FBI's most wanted terrorist list. In addition to past accusations of Iraq war crimes and violating UN laws, even before the mailed-off anthrax letters started showing up, followed by the subsequent pretext phase with Israeli intelligence giving bogus intel about an Iraqi anthrax connection through a meeting in Prague with Iraqi intelligence and 9/11 ringleader Mohammed Atta, although blatantly anti-Saddam propaganda-driven, Lori Milroy is, and has launched her career as a journalist in a joint venture with future fraud post-9/11 WMD propagandist Judith Miller. In a book back in 1990, Saddam Hussein and the Crisis in the Gulf was the first prominent publication that instigated American public support for Desert Storm, which was released in October of 1990. But something else about Milroy's motives and disingenuous assertion that Ramzi Yousef would be a prime Iraqi agent, or that the 1993 World Trade Center bombing was a conspiracy carried out by the behest of Saddam Hussein, is that she ignores Ramzi Yousef's only newspaper interview to Al Hayat, where he told Regida Durham, the United States is applying a system of collective punishment against Iraq and Libya. When either government makes a mistake, the United States punishes the people in their entirety for the government's mistake. We are reciprocating the treatment. But more importantly, what Milroy completely ignores is Yousef's closing statement in court before his sentencing, proclaiming himself to be a terrorist. He said, "And you killed civilians in Vietnam with chemicals, as with the so-called Orange Agent. You killed civilians and innocent people, not soldiers. Innocent people every single war you went. You went to wars more than any other country in this century. And then you have the nerve to talk about killing innocent people? And now you have invented new ways to kill innocent people. You have so-called economic embargo, which kills nobody other than children and elderly people, and which, other than Iraq, you have been placing the economic embargo on Cuba and other countries for over 35 years. Yousef additionally said, which is not in the public transcript but mentioned in a paper written in 2000 by John V. Parchini of the Rand Corporation, Saddam Hussein, when he killed thousands of his people in the 1980s with chemical weapons, as further evidence of the U.S. government's disregard for civilian lives. Yousef certainly doesn't sound like a fan of Saddam Hussein, and another major assertion made from Milroy that is flat out wrong is that Yousef is an Iraqi.
Well, I think that Mr. McCarthy understood from my briefing that his case was terribly weak. In fact, I view it as nonsense, this Islamic international jihad conspiracy. Now, if America wants to buy that, how about the conspiracy of Freemasons and Jews that overthrew the Russian czars? Then if America will buy that, I'll sell them the Brooklyn Bridge.
But to give some credit for which he stated before September 11th, Milroy was momentarily right on one thing when it came to the first attack on the Twin Towers, as pointed out as to why the U.S. government wouldn't extradite Abdul Yasin from Iraq. Quoted in the Boston Globe on January 17, 1995, Milroy said, "I think that they have tried to make us comfortable with the assumption that the terrorists are all in jail and that the good guys won."
We know, for example, in connection with the original World Trade Center bombing in '93, that one of the bombers was Iraqi, returned to Iraq after the attack of '93, and we've learned subsequent to that, since we got into Baghdad and got into the intelligence files, that this individual probably also received financing from the Iraqi government as well as safe haven. Now, is there a connection between the Iraqi government and the original World Trade Center bombing in '93? We know, as I say, that one of the perpetrators of that act did in fact receive support from the Iraqi government after the fact.
Even though it is often disputed whether Osama bin Laden really died in 2011 or had already died long before, as already aforementioned, the official status and theory regarding him and the September 11th attacks is that the FBI was never able to prove he had anything to do with 9/11, as bin Laden was only wanted for the East Africa Embassy and USS Cole bombings. So just from approaching this subject and unresolved matter, we already have problems putting bin Laden's face behind 9/11 and or KSM as a mastermind due to the conditions of his confessions, and yet no actual evidence to prove they were the main planners or coordinators. In either case, it would seem that whoever was arranging these attacks structurally as an Arab or fundamentalist organization seems to have a mutual interest with Israel by carrying out terrorist attacks all too convenient to set up a pretext to strike Iraq and remove Saddam Hussein from power. But comparing in contrast with what we do know versus unanswered questions regarding September 11th, that the more geopolitical enlightened within 9/11 truth that comprehends the role of foreign intelligence can see that Israeli intel is at fault and or behind the false pretexts that misled to the disastrous war on terror in Iraq, simultaneously as the Mossad in some great part being behind the attacks, is rather easy to envision and implicate that at least at the bare minimum that the Mossad oiled the wheels of the Al-Qaeda Trojan horse. But coming back to 1993 and looking at this Jersey apartment building, with a trail and a good portion of conspirators already set, with the Iraqis, Abdullah Musab Yasin, Mossad spy Yousef-Ajaj as a neighbor above, who already shared Mohammed Salameh as a roommate, and address that Ramzi Yousef was barely at, as well as over a dozen more suspicious occupants unidentified. This is all a big revelation, and you can see why just with Yasin alone, who was hidden from the official narrative for a great period of time, that federal investigators would have been persistent in diminishing any of the press's questions or follow-up reports over the address and their botched investigation with letting Yasin go, and not just over the inquiry by itself about Yousef-Ajaj. And with this revelation also comes a greater revelation, not just because of the unanswered questions regarding Yousef and his family background, but that he even first told others that he was an Iraqi when first arriving to the US, added with entering on a fake Iraqi passport, all of it very telling. But so is realizing that if Mossad asset Ahmadinejad had also been successful entering the country at JFK Airport, he would have also likely been staying at the same apartment. Basically, you couldn't get any more effective being in that sort of company as far as what was witnessed and items found amongst these individuals, residences, and spaces, added with training experiences and capabilities. It's no wonder that some law enforcement deemed it as the conspirators' den versus the Panrapo apartment garage address. But regardless if participants were incarcerated or not, the theory that Israeli intelligence would have known for certain what was going on, or worse, that they were in part managing part of the operation, is very possible, considering what we know happens 8.5 years later. But there are still quite a few unanswered questions about the Trade Center bombing, or at least the build-up to it, ironically, because you have to wonder, are we really to believe the FBI just hired Imad Salem to infiltrate mosques originally in 1991, just over the shooting of a racist rabbi and some unknown Egyptian imam who only first appears in July of 1990, or were the feds already keeping an eye on the cell? As you may recall, it's obvious the FBI were already surveying the suspects who frequented the mosques before all of this, going back as far as 1989 with photos taken of Salameh and Abu Halima with El Sayed Nosair at the Galveston shooting range. But for what in 1989 exactly? As no Islamic or Arab terrorist attacks had occurred on U.S. soil. Remember the ABC Nightline Investigate World Trade Center Ground Zero with Ted Koppel from April 1st, 1993?